Hi guys! In this video, we'll go over the basics of setting up external MIDI instruments to work with FL Studio. I'll be using hardware synths, but the same principles apply to other MIDI instruments like eDrums. We'll cover setting up your instrument in FL Studio, sending notes to your instrument so it plays along with your track, recording notes played on your instrument, automating parameters, recording the audio output from your instrument, things to look out for, and ways to make your life easier. I won't be digging deep into MIDI itself. There's enough other resources online you can turn to if you are new to MIDI. So let's first look at setting up your instrument. The manual covers this subject pretty well, so you might want to read it. First, you need to connect your instrument to your PC. Most modern instruments support USB. Simply connect your instrument to the computer with a USB cable. If you don't have a USB connection, you need to use DIN5 MIDI cables and a MIDI interface. Interfaces cost about 15 smackaroos for a single connection. Make sure you use a MIDI cable because not all DIN5 cables are wired the same. Connect the MIDI out on your interface to the MIDI in on your instrument to send MIDI from FL Studio to your instrument. If you want to use your instrument as a controller, connect the MIDI out port on your instrument to the MIDI in port on your interface. You might need to install MIDI drivers. Check your manual or the manufacturer's website. Once your drivers are installed, the device shows up in the MIDI settings in FL Studio. If you don't see the device, check you installed your drivers correctly. If your instrument is connected via USB, you'll see its name. If you're using a MIDI interface, you will see the name of your MIDI interface, not of the instrument. In my case, the M4U is a MIDI interface with 4 ports. The Venom and Ultranova are synths connected via USB. Assign a unique output port to each instrument you have by selecting the output and using the port setting. Ports assigned in this way are FL Studio specific and used to route MIDI within FL Studio. My Morpho synthesizer is connected to my M4U MIDI interface on physical port 4. Let's assign this to port 4 in FL Studio. This means that any data sent to FL Studio's internal MIDI port 4 is sent to the Morpho. Enable the MIDI input device to send the notes you play on the instrument to FL Studio. If you have knobs, sliders, and buttons, you may be able to use these with FL Studio too. I'm going to enable the input from both my Morpho on port 4 of the M4U and my Venom synth so I can use its keyboard as a controller. You can assign ports to inputs too, but you don't need to for most use cases. For more details on MIDI ports and routing MIDI within FL Studio, check out my video on that subject. FL Studio includes the MIDI Out plugin for sending MIDI data to hardware instruments. Let's add MIDI Out to the instrument rack. To send MIDI to your instruments, select the port you configured in the MIDI settings. In my case, that's port 4. If I add notes to the piano roll, they are sent to my Morpho. So you can hear it, I've routed the audio from the Morpho to FL Studio. I'll show you how to do this later in case you are new to audio recording. Use the knobs in the MIDI Out plugin to send MIDI CCs, continuous controllers, and other MIDI messages to your instrument. You can use these to control parameters on your instrument. What parameters you can control and how depends on your instrument. Check your manual. It should have a MIDI implementation chart. This is the manual for my Morpho. We can see that CC102 controls the filter frequency. Let's assign the first knob to send CC102. Right-click the knob and select Configure, then fill in the fields. If I play back the notes and move the knob, you can hear it controlling the cutoff on the filter. You can add events to the piano roll to control this knob. Right-click the knob and select Edit Events. This will open the event editor and you can edit the events here. but personally, I find it makes more sense to edit events in context with the notes, which you can do in the piano roll. If you open up the piano roll after selecting Edit Events for a parameter, the parameter shows up at the bottom of the piano roll as a target for events. You can also link the knob to an automation clip, but I think it makes sense to keep performance-related CCs in the piano roll with the notes. A lot of the time, you want to align the events and notes with one another. You can use the patch and bank controls to choose the preset on your instrument. You'll need to consult your manual for a list of patches and banks. The short version is that there are 128 patches per bank selected from the drop-down. Unless you are using a workstation keyboard, the names are not going to match your presets. What matters is the number, not the name. A word of warning. You will need to save any changes you make to the patch on your device if you work this way. The patch settings will not be saved with your project, only the patch number and bank. Provided you enabled your MIDI input in the MIDI settings, you can record notes played on your instrument. Just make sure that you have enabled Notes as a recording option by right-clicking the Record button. Add a pattern or choose the pattern you want to record to, then arm Record and hit Play. I'll be using my Venom to play these parts, as the Morpho does not have a keyboard. The notes I play are received by the MIDI Out plugin and then sent to the Morpho from there. The notes you play are recorded to the current pattern. You can change the counting and toggle the metronome on and off using these buttons. Let's look at recording some automation. Unfortunately, the knobs in the MIDI Out plugin don't automatically respond to incoming CCs with the same number. If you want to record automation, you need to manually link the controls on your instrument to the knobs in the MIDI Out plugin one by one. Not all instruments send CCs or MIDI messages when you use knobs and sliders. To link a CC to one of the knobs, right-click the knob and select Link to Controller. Simply twiddle the knob or slider you want to link and click on Accept. If this isn't working, make sure you have Auto Detect on, and if it still doesn't work, check your manual to see what messages the knob sends and if you can get it to send CCs. Once your link is set up, right-click the Record button and make sure that automation is checked. Then arm Record and hit Play to record your automation. But before we move on, a few words of warning. Look out for MIDI feedback loops. You will create one if you are playing your instrument directly, sending the notes you are playing to the MIDI Out plugin in FL Studio, and then sending the notes back from MIDI Out to your instrument. Your instrument will respond to both the notes you play on it and the same note received from FL Studio. You can get very strange results when this happens. One way to avoid a feedback loop is to only use one direction at a time. Set the port in the MIDI Out plugin to None, and it will no longer send incoming notes back to your instrument. Most instruments also have an option called Local Off. This stops the instrument from responding to notes played on the instrument itself. Instead, it only responds to incoming MIDI data. Consult your manual for details, as setting this up depends on your instrument. Now, you can avoid a lot of the disadvantages of the MIDI Out plugin by using a VST editor instead. Some modern synths include a VST editor, like my Ultranova. There are also various third-party VST editors that you can buy. Another option is to use something like Ctrlr, which is free. Ctrlr allows you to create your own editor and there are templates available to download. Both controller and VST editors work in very similar ways. Let's look at a VST editor first. This is the editor for my Ultranova, but they are all very similar. The editor communicates directly with your instrument. Depending on the editor, you might need to set up the MIDI in and out connections in the editor itself. I don't need to do this for the Ultranova. It automatically communicates with the instrument and also automatically sets local off on the synth itself when the editor is running. But I'll show you how this works when we look at controller. Changes made on the instrument, such as turning knobs or switching the patch, are automatically reflected in the editor. Similarly, any changes made in the VST are sent to your instrument. You also get patch recall this way. Controller works in much the same way. There's a template for the Morpho, but in order to use controller with the Morpho, I first need to disable the M4U inputs and outputs in FL Studio's MIDI settings so they are available to controller. This is because controller, and many editors, require you to set up the MIDI connections directly in the editor. Most MIDI devices are single client. Only one thing can use them at a time. So if you want to use the device with an editor, it can't be in use by FL Studio. That means you need to disable the MIDI device in the MIDI settings in FL Studio. This is probably the biggest disadvantage of an editor. It means you can't use the instrument to control other plugins while its input is linked to the editor. If you want to control other plugins, you need to remove the input in the editor and re-enable the MIDI device in FL Studio. You can avoid these issues with a separate MIDI controller. You might want to consider getting one if this affects your workflow. I've already loaded up the panel in controller. The first step is to select the instrument's MIDI input and output, in my case, port 4 on the M4U. You also need to enable MIDI through plugin host output device to send MIDI data from FL Studio to your instrument. This will allow you to send notes from the piano roll. I can move the knobs in the plugin to change the sound from the Morpho, and I can move knobs on the Morpho and controller is updated accordingly. With either a VST editor or controller, you can easily record knob and slider movements. Right-click the record button and make sure automation is enabled. Select the target pattern, arm record and press play. Twiddle the knob to record the automation to the selected pattern. If you prefer to draw events with the mouse, you need to add the knob as an event target. Move the control and select Edit Events from the Multi-Link to Controllers menu. The parameter is then available as a target in the piano roll. And don't forget that you can create automation clips from recorded events. For me, the fact that VST editors and controller respond to knob and slider movements and save the patch as part of your project outweighs any disadvantages. I definitely recommend you check if there's a controller panel for your synth or a third-party VST editor if your instrument doesn't ship with a VST editor of its own. In order to render out your finished track, you need to record the audio from your instrument. While you can work on a track without recording the audio and simply monitor it playing back from your instrument, that won't work when rendering out MP3 or WAV files. The audio needs to be part of the project itself. There's two ways to record audio in FL Studio: directly to the playlist or using Edison. Whichever method you prefer, I strongly recommend that you set up a project folder whenever you start a new project or before you make your first recording. Any audio you record to the playlist or drag to the playlist from Edison is saved in this folder, keeping all recordings neatly in one place. Naming your audio recordings also helps you manage them. I'll come to that in a moment. To record the audio, you need to route the audio from your instrument to your PC. If your instrument also functions as an audio interface and you are using that as your ASIO device in FL Studio, you should be able to send the audio directly. Otherwise, you will need to hook up the instrument to your audio interface, which is what I am doing. Select a free mixer channel and select the audio input your instrument is connected to. The mixer channel is automatically armed for recording to the playlist when first selecting an input. Because I already had the input selected, I need to arm the track manually. Name the mixer track, as this is used for the name of the audio file. Make sure you are set up to record audio by right-clicking the record button. I recommend enabling disarm on stop too, otherwise you'll find yourself recording all sorts of junk when you play back the track because you forgot to disarm record manually. Then simply hit record and play. FL Studio sends the notes in your arrangement to your MIDI instrument, and the audio is recorded to the playlist. Alternatively, you can use Edison to record your audio. This is my preferred option. To do so, add Edison to the mixer channel. I strongly recommend Edison is synced to start recording on play. Set up this way, Edison only starts recording when you press play in FL Studio. Hit F2 to open the properties windows and enter a name in the title field. This is used to name the audio file, so make a habit of doing this before each recording. Arm the record button in Edison instead of FL Studio and hit play in FL Studio to record the audio. Once you are done recording, simply drag the recording out of Edison and into the playlist. Refer to the FL Studio manual for more information on recording audio. It covers a lot more than I have covered. Because you need to record the audio in real time, I recommend you only record the audio when you need to. Polish the part first, then record it. You may also need to slightly adjust the alignment of audio recordings to compensate for any latency. Okay, so that's a broad overview of what you need to connect your MIDI instrument to FL Studio. Now, if you are new to the world of MIDI and hardware, it's quite common for things to go wrong. Troubleshooting is mainly about following your connections from the source to destination and figuring out what is going wrong where. If you are sending MIDI data from FL Studio, make sure that the right output is selected. If you are sending MIDI to FL Studio, make sure you either have the input enabled in the MIDI settings or that the right input is selected in your VST editor or controller and is disabled in the MIDI settings. Make sure to connect MIDI out to MIDI in if you are using DIN5 MIDI cables. Pay particular attention to MIDI feedback loops. Make sure you aren't sending MIDI data from your instrument to FL Studio straight back to the instrument. Bad things can happen if you do this. Use the local off option on your instrument when using the instrument as a controller. Remember that only one thing can access a MIDI device at once. You can't have the input enabled in FL Studio's MIDI settings and be selected in an editor. When recording, make sure you have set up FL Studio to record notes and automation. Keep an eye on the message area at the top left. Whenever MIDI information is received, it will be indicated by the knob icon, and any notes you play are displayed here. An orange knob with a tick indicates a MIDI message that is linked to something in FL Studio. A green knob indicates MIDI data that is received, but is unlinked in FL Studio. You can also open the debug log in FL Studio to see what MIDI messages are being sent and received to help you troubleshoot. Definitely read the manual that came with your instrument and read up on the different types of MIDI messages if you want to dive deeper. If you can, use a VST editor or controller. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.